I built Arclight. You have nothing here.
I own 67% of this.
Your Whitmore Holdings?
You never bothered to see who I was. Your appointment has no authority without me.
What exactly did you sign?
Your authority is suspended, effective now.
You planned this? Why did you hide this from me?
I gave you 8 years to notice.
I thought you needed me.
No, you needed me invisible.
The night Maura Cole sat alone at table 27. The ballroom of the Meridian Grand was the most expensive room she had ever paid for, and the only room in the world where nobody knew her name. Arclight Technologies was celebrating 13 years. Her 13 years. She watched her husband take the stage in a suit she hadn't chosen beside a woman whose promotion required one signature to be valid. Hers. The microphone crackled. Lane smiled at the room like a man who had built everything in it. Maura opened her journal and wrote a single line. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. But the story did not begin in a ballroom. It began 13 years earlier, and it began with Maura, which meant it had always, in some sense, been moving toward this night. The Meridian Grand's ballroom held 400 people on a good evening. Tonight, it held 412, by Maura's count, because she had approved the final guest list herself through the event coordinator's email chain, and had noticed the 12 additions Lane submitted 2 days before the event without telling her. Small things like that had stopped surprising her. She had learned to count rather than ask. She had arrived early. That was deliberate. She wanted to choose the table herself, and she wanted the room to fill up around her before anyone thought to wonder why the woman in the simple navy dress was sitting alone near the kitchen corridor. Table 27 was set for 8. No one else was seated there. The centerpiece was a single white orchid in a clear vase. Maura had specified orchids for all the tables, because her grandmother had kept them on the windowsill, and because they were elegant without demanding attention. Lane arrived 40 minutes later with Stella Grant on his arm. Maura had watched Stella work a room before. She was good at it. Precise, high energy, always angled slightly toward whoever held the most influence in a given cluster. She had a laugh that landed at the exact right volume. Tonight she wore red, which was not an accident. Red in a room full of corporate navy and charcoal was a statement. Stella made statements the way other people breathed. Lane looked the way he always looked at company events, larger than himself, lit from within by the belief that the room agreed with him. He had the specific confidence of a man who had never seriously doubted his own narrative. He wore a charcoal suit Maura didn't recognize and had clearly had tailored recently, which meant he'd charged it to his personal account rather than the company one. Another small thing. Patricia Cole found Maura's table before the first round of drinks was poured. Lane's mother moved through crowds the way certain weather systems did, with apparent purpose and a tendency to leave damage in her wake. She was 66 and had the bearing of someone who had always considered herself more important than the room she was entering. "You look appropriate, Maura," she said, setting her champagne glass down on the table and surveying the centerpiece with mild disapproval. "For a guest," Maura looked up at her. "Thank you, Patricia. Lane's speaking tonight. Did you know that?" A pause, designed. "I assumed you might not. You two seem to operate on different schedules these days." "I know," Maura said. She picked up her pen and turned back to the journal. Patricia waited a moment for a reaction that didn't come, then moved on. Lane's speech began at 8:15. It ran for 14 minutes. Maura timed it. He thanked the board. He thanked the investors. He thanked the extraordinary team that has driven Arclight's growth over the past decade and more. He used the phrase "my vision" 3 times and "what I built" twice. He did not mention Maura. He did not glance toward table 27. He stood in the gold light of the ballroom of a hotel Arclight's budget had reserved, at the head of a company that generated $65 billion in annual valuation, and he spoke as if every sentence was autobiographical. Then he paused for effect, the way he always did before the moment he'd been building toward. "Tonight, with pride and full confidence in Arclight's future, I am honored to name Stella Grant as our new Chief Strategy Officer. Applause filled the room. Stella walked to the stage in her red dress, accepted a glass of champagne from Lane's hand, and smiled at the room with the expression of someone receiving something that was always meant for them. At table 27, Franklin Pace appeared at Maura's elbow. She hadn't seen him approach. He was 61, silver-haired, with the careful movements of a man who had spent his career knowing things he couldn't say in the wrong rooms. He set a manila folder on the table in front of her without a word. Maura opened it. The authorization form was on top, highlighted in one place. Any appointment to Chief Strategy Officer or equivalent requires written authorization from the controlling interest holder of Whitmore Holdings LLC, ArcLight's majority shareholder. She read it once. She already knew what it said. Franklin leaned down slightly. He submitted an authorization bypass this morning. The board flagged it immediately. The appointment is not valid without Whitmore Holdings sign-off. He paused. It was never going to be. Maura closed the folder. She looked at the stage, where Lane was toasting Stella in front of 400 people. "I know," she said. She uncapped her pen. 13 years earlier, Maura Whitmore was 26 years old, and she was done being told that her algorithm was impressive, but her pitch was premature. She had heard 3 versions of that sentence in 3 different conference rooms over the course of 6 months. The first investor had leaned back in his chair and said she should come back with more traction. The second had listened to her full presentation, asked 2 good technical questions, and then suggested she might consider finding a more seasoned co-founder to anchor the leadership team. He had not meant a technical co-founder. She understood that. The third had been the most direct. Your early stage in more ways than one. She was 26, female, and building a company in an industry that had decided, on balance, that those things were risks. She drove back to the workspace she rented by the day in Palo Alto and called her grandmother. Ruth Whitmore answered on the second ring, the way she always did, as if she had been waiting. "They said no again," Maura said. "I heard it in your voice." A pause, the comfortable kind. "What are you going to do?" Maura had been staring at the algorithm architecture she'd spent the better part of 2 years building, a supply chain optimization system that could predict disruption patterns in real time, reroute logistics before the break happened rather than after. The patents were filed. The proof of concept data was strong. The system worked. She knew it worked. "I'm going to make it so they can't say no," she said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "Build it in the dark, baby. Let them discover what you've made when the light comes on." It took Maura 3 weeks to structure Whitmore Holdings LLC. She chose the name without deliberating. It was her grandmother's name, and it was the only name that felt like something she could build on. The holding company would own the controlling interest in whatever Maura built. Her name would not appear on the investor-facing materials. The founding entity would. She filed the articles of incorporation for ArcLight Technologies the following month. The name came to her at 4 in the morning, sitting on the back step of her grandmother's house during a summer visit, watching the porch light burn against the Georgia dark. Ruth had kept that light on as long as Maura could remember, not as a security measure, but as a signal. You could always find your way back. The light was always on, ArcLight. Strong, steady, visible from a distance. A light that didn't ask permission to illuminate. The first round of funding came through a regional development grant and 2 angel investors who evaluated Whitmore Holdings without knowing they were evaluating a 26-year-old's holding company. The pitch focused on the technology. The technology was undeniable. Maura hired 3 engineers, then 6, then 12. She worked 16-hour days in an office she could barely afford, and did not spend a single one of those days wondering if she'd made the right choice. She knew what she was building. She knew it was real. The first major enterprise contract came from a mid-sized regional logistics company that had been hemorrhaging money on supply chain failures for 3 consecutive quarters. ArcLight's system cut their disruption rate by 62% in the first cycle. The company renewed at 3 times the initial rate. Word moved the way it always moves in industries where the margins are tight, quickly and through the people who matter most. Within 18 months, ArcLight had its Series A round. Within 3 years, its valuation crossed $500 million. Franklin Pace, a corporate attorney with a background in tech governance, came on as chief legal officer in year 2 and was the only executive Maura brought fully into the truth of Whitmore Holdings. "You realize," Franklin had said the day she told him, "that you are going to have to tell people eventually." Eventually, Maura had agreed. She did not specify when. By year 8, ArcLight's valuation crossed $20 billion. The government defense contracts pushed it to 40, then higher. By the time the company was 13 years old and celebrating in a ballroom Maura had approved and paid for through the corporate account, ArcLight Technologies was valued at $65 billion. $65 billion, built by a woman whose name nobody in that room had connected to the company they were celebrating. And then, at 31, at a charity function in Boston, where she'd gone to represent a foundation she supported under a different name, she had met a man named Lane Cole. He had a hot smile and a way of listening that made her feel, briefly, like the room had contracted to just the two of them. She had not expected to fall in love at a charity function. She had not expected much of anything by then, except the work. But she had. And that had changed everything about the timeline she thought she was building toward. Lane Cole had been working as a senior operations analyst at a logistics consulting firm when Maura met him. He was 35, detail-oriented, in the way that made him genuinely good at his work rather than merely precise, and he asked questions that showed he'd actually processed what she'd said rather than just waited for it to finish talking. That last quality was rarer than it should have been. She told him she worked in corporate strategy and consulting. It was not a lie, exactly. It was the version of herself she had learned to offer first. The one that didn't require explanation or skepticism. The one that let her read a room before the room decided it had read her. Lane never pushed for more detail. At the time, she had interpreted this as respect. He seemed content to know what she told him, to be present in whatever space she allowed. He was good company. He was attentive in the way that mattered. He remembered that she preferred her coffee without sugar after she mentioned it once. Remembered the name of the project she said was giving her trouble 3 weeks after she'd brought it up. He was, in those first months, genuinely interested in her as a person rather than as a credential. She fell in love with him the way she built companies, incrementally, carefully, with full awareness of the risk. They married after 18 months. Small ceremony. She kept Whitmore as a middle name. The conversation with Franklin happened the week after the honeymoon. "Are you going to tell him?" Franklin asked. He was standing in the doorway of her office with the particular expression he wore, when he had already decided what the right answer was and was giving her the courtesy of arriving at it herself. Maura thought about it. She thought about the way Lane had looked at her at the ceremony, like she was the most important thing in his field of vision. She thought about how much she wanted to be that, just that, for someone, without the holding company architecture underneath it. "Not yet," she said. Franklin nodded once. He did not push. He had learned in 2 years working with her that Maura Whitmore made decisions with a long view, and that the long view usually proved out. She brought Lane into ArcLight 8 months into the marriage. She framed it as an opportunity she'd heard about through a board contact, which was true, in the limited sense that she was the board contact. Lane's operational background was a genuine fit for the SVP of Operations role. She was not doing him a favor. She was making a business decision that happened to involve her husband. She told herself the distinction mattered. He was good at the work. That had not been a foregone conclusion. She had considered the possibility that proximity to the company's actual decision-making would reveal seams in his professional capability. Instead, Lane proved himself methodical, good with teams, and better at managing upward than most people his age. He ran the operations division with clear structure and got results that were measurable and real. When the board considered him for promotion to president 3 years in, the discussion was substantive. The case was strong. Maura authorized it through Whitmore Holdings. As she authorized everything at that level, and Lane received the news as a unanimous board decision made in recognition of his performance. He thanked the board chairman in an email that Maura read through the executive distribution list. He thanked several senior executives. He did not thank Maura. He had not told her about the promotion process. It was possible he did not think to. His first speech as president was in the main boardroom. She sat in the back, in the chair she had occupied for 10 years at every major company gathering, present enough to observe, positioned just outside the primary sight lines of anyone who wasn't looking for her specifically. "I want to build on the culture of innovation that has made ArcLight what it is," Lane said, "and I want to do it with the team that has built it with me. Not with us, not within the company. With me." She wrote it in her journal that night, not as evidence, not as accusation, just as a data point, a record of how the language was beginning to shift. Franklin had caught it too, she suspected, though he didn't say anything directly. He had started sending her the executive communication summaries with the occasional phrase underlined, just lightly, just enough that she'd notice. It was his way of keeping her informed without editorializing. 3 years into Lane's presidency, he stopped mentioning Maura in board meetings. He'd been infrequent about it before. "She was my wife. She works in consulting at industry events," which was accurate if incomplete. But in board meetings, he had initially referred to her as someone I consult informally or an outside perspective I find useful. That language had faded. By year 4, she wasn't in any of it. She watched it happen. She watched him become, in the telling, the sole architect of a company she had built before she ever knew his name. She watched it, and she wrote it down, and she told herself she was still deciding what to do with what she knew. It took 2 more years and a VP of strategy named Stella Grant before the decision made itself. The erosion had not happened all at once. That was the thing about it, it never did. It happened in sentences, in small revisions, in the accumulation of moments that were individually explicable and collectively devastating. Lane had always had a gift for narrative. He understood how to frame a story so that it held together in a listener's mind, how to sequence information so that the conclusion felt inevitable. He had used it effectively in client presentations and board briefings. Maura had admired it early on. She had not fully anticipated what it would mean when he turned that gift on the history of her company. It started with the investor presentations. He had always been the public face of ArcLight's executive team. Maura had kept herself out of investor relations deliberately. Another layer of distance between the company's visible leadership and the name on the Whitmore Holdings documents. Lane was good in those rooms. He was polished and energized and credible. The presentations worked. But somewhere in year 2 of his presidency, ArcLight's strategic vision, developed by our leadership team, became the framework I've been building toward for the past several years. The shift was subtle enough that no one in those rooms would have noticed. Maura noticed. She received the recordings afterward through the executive distribution protocol and listened to them in the quiet of her study, and she noticed. She corrected the written materials when she had access to them. She updated the language in the board documents that moved through Whitmore Holdings review. She did not confront Lane about the presentations. She told herself she was choosing the right moment. Patricia Cole had moved in for what was supposed to be a 6-week stay following a minor health event the previous winter. The 6 weeks had become 8 months. She occupied the guest wing, with the ease of someone who had decided the arrangement was permanent and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Patricia had never been unkind to Maura in any way that could be quoted directly. She operated in implications. "Lane is under so much pressure, it must be difficult for you, not quite being in that world. He carries this company so completely, I worry about who's carrying him at home." She looked at Maura the way people look at furniture they're considering moving, present, functional, but not quite right for the room. When ArcLight closed a major government contract worth $2 billion, a strategic partnership Maura had structured over 14 months through 3 rounds of proposals that Lane had presented to the Government Procurement Committee. Lane hosted a celebration dinner at the house. He spoke at the table for 20 minutes about the instinct that told me this was the right partnership at the right moment. Maura had organized the data models that made the risk assessment viable. She passed the bread and said nothing. It was the speech draft that finally made her stop correcting. She found it by accident. It was in a folder on the shared household network drive, under a file name that suggested it was a draft for the ArcLight Founders Forum, an annual industry event. She opened it because she thought it was a document she'd been asked to review. The second paragraph read, "I had a vision for this company when I founded it that others thought was premature. I built ArcLight from early-stage promise into a $65 billion enterprise through a combination of strategic patience and relentless execution. The founding vision was mine. The growth has been mine." She read it twice. Then she closed the document and opened the journal and wrote down what she had just read, word for word. She did not correct the draft. She had been correcting for 6 years. The corrections had not changed the direction of anything. They had only delayed it slightly, the way sandbags delay a flood. What was required was not another correction. Stella Grant had joined ArcLight as VP of Strategy 4 months after Maura stopped correcting the drafts. Lane had hired her directly within his authority at the VP level, from a competitor firm. He mentioned it to Maura the evening before Stella's first day, not as a consultation, but as information. "New VP starts tomorrow, strategy. You might see her around." Stella was sharp and fast, and had the specific kind of ambition that is useful in an organization and corrosive in a person. Within 6 weeks, she was in every meeting Lane attended. Within 3 months, Franklin began sending Maura the badge and logs for the executive floor, with occasional times circled in red. The night Stella stayed 3 hours after everyone else had gone, the lobby camera logged both their badge outs at 11:47 p.m. Franklin forwarded the report without comment, as he always did when he had something to say that he preferred not to put into words. Maura looked at the timestamp. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened the journal and wrote down the date. Franklin's report arrived on a Tuesday, in a sealed envelope marked for Maura's attention only, delivered by a courier to the home address she had registered under the Whitmore Holdings administrative contact. Not the address Lane used for company mail, not the one that appeared in any ArcLight directory. Franklin had been meticulous about that kind of detail for 13 years. She had come to trust the meticulousness the way she trusts the structure of the company itself. She opened the envelope at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning, before anyone else in the house was moving. The report ran to 22 pages. Franklin had retained a corporate investigations firm, one that specialized in executive conduct documentation rather than personal surveillance, and the materials had been assembled over the previous 4 months through a combination of badge logs, expense reports, corporate calendar data, and communication metadata that the firm was legally permitted to access through ArcLight's internal governance protocols. The picture that emerged was not shocking. That was the thing that stayed with Maura longest as she read through it. The absence of shock. She had known in the way you know things before you have the words for them. The report simply gave her the words. Lane and Stella had been meeting outside business contexts since the 3rd month of Stella's employment. 3 business trips over 5 months showed calendar entries that placed them at the same locations on days when no company business had been scheduled. There was a hotel receipt submitted to the corporate expense system under a conference reimbursement code for a conference ArcLight did not attend and had not registered for. There was a pattern in the calendar metadata of meetings scheduled between them that were categorized as strategy sessions and took place in the evenings, in Lane's private office on the executive floor after the administrative staff had gone home. Maura turned to the second section of the report. The accessed records were, in some ways, more important than the personal evidence. Lane had been granting Stella access to restricted board strategy documents, materials that required executive director clearance Stella did not hold. She had been invited to 4 executive sessions in the past 6 months, all of them scheduled through Lane's office, all of them in rooms where her VP-level credentials should have triggered an access flag. The flags had been manually overridden each time by Lane. He had also, in 3 instances, submitted ArcLight's strategic position papers to external parties, 2 prospective enterprise clients, and 1 defense contractor, under Stella's signature, without board disclosure. The position papers were Maura's frameworks, the ones she had built through Whitmore Holdings' strategic advisory input over the previous 3 years. Stella's name was on them. Lane's cover note called her ArcLight's lead strategist. Maura set the report down and looked out the window. Then she turned to the last 6 pages. The CSO promotion paperwork had been submitted to the board 6 days earlier. Lane had filed it directly, bypassing the standard nomination process, with a cover note that read, "Expedited review authorized by President under Emergency Succession Protocol. No additional board process required." The Emergency Succession Protocol was a provision in ArcLight's charter designed for situations where a C-suite position became vacant without warning, a sudden departure, an incapacitation. It had never been intended as a mechanism to fast-track a promotion for a VP, who had been in the company for less than 8 months and whose candidacy had not been reviewed by the Compensation Committee, the Governance Committee, or the Nominating Board. And it was irrelevant in any case because the Emergency Succession Protocol did not supersede the Charter's majority shareholder provision. Any C-suite appointment at ArcLight, emergency or otherwise, required written authorization from the controlling interest holder of Whitmore Holdings, LLC. Lane did not know this. He had never read the charter with the attention it deserved. He had absorbed the version of ArcLight's governance that was presented to him in his first weeks, and he had not looked closely at the underlying structure since. Maura called Franklin at 7:15. "He thinks the emergency protocol overrides the majority holder requirement," she said. "He's wrong," Franklin said. "I know." A pause. "What happens if I sign the authorization? Stella becomes CSO. Lane's position is validated. The bypass is retroactively treated as a procedural irregularity rather than an unauthorized act. And if I don't sign, the appointment is void. We move to the full governance review process, which at this point includes the audit of unauthorized access grants and the expense reimbursement irregularities. Those become board-level matters." Maura looked at the report on the table. She thought about the speech draft. She thought about 4 years of board meetings where her name had not been spoken. "Let him announce it at the gala," she said. "Bring the authorization form. I'll be at table 27. There was a pause on Franklin's end. Not hesitation, she knew his hesitations, and this wasn't one of them. It was the pause of a man confirming that he had heard correctly. "All right," he said. She hung up. She picked up her grandmother's journal, opened it to the last written page, and looked at the date she had written there 4 months earlier. She added 1 word below it. "Ready." Patricia came to the house 2 days before the gala, with a bottle of wine she didn't offer to open and an opinion she hadn't been asked for. She found Maura at the kitchen table, working through a contract addendum on her laptop. She said it was a client document, which was true enough, and sat down across from her without asking. "I've been thinking about the event Thursday," Patricia said. She poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the counter. "Lane's going to have a big night." "I expect so," Maura said. "He's earned it." Patricia set the glass down with a careful click. "You know, when he told me what he was planning with Stella's promotion, I thought, that's Lane. That's him seeing talent and lifting it. He has that instinct." A pause that was not accidental. Stella understands what it means to be next to someone building something real. That kind of support, that attunement, it's not something everyone has. It's not something you can learn if it isn't natural. Maura looked up from the screen. She looked at Patricia for a moment, the practiced expression of someone delivering a wound with the care of someone wrapping a gift. "Thank you, Patricia," she said. She went back to the contract. Patricia waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. She finished her water, said something about needing to be somewhere, and left. Maura did not move from the table for 10 minutes after the door closed. She sat with her hands still on the keyboard and let the silence of the house settle around her. Then she closed the laptop, made herself a cup of tea, and carried it to the study. Lane came home late that evening. She heard the car in the driveway at 11:15. She was still in the study, reading. She heard him come in, heard the brief sounds of someone moving through a house as quietly as possible, or as quietly as someone moves when they're trying not to be noticed without actually caring much about being noticed. He didn't come to the study. She didn't call out to him. They did not speak that night. She did not know when she had stopped counting these nights, or whether that was progress or a form of grief that had learned to be quiet. The morning before the gala, Lane was gone before she woke. There was a coffee cup on the counter that he'd rinsed and left in the rack, which meant he'd been in the kitchen while she slept. That was all. The house was empty and very still, and the September light came through the kitchen windows at a low angle that made the whole room look like it was holding its breath. She took her grandmother's journal from the desk and sat down in the armchair by the window. She had been keeping this journal, the third one now, the first two filled and kept in a locked drawer, for 6 years. She had used it for everything. Decisions she was working through, records she needed in a form that wasn't a document, things she had seen and needed to put somewhere outside her own head. Her grandmother had given her the first one. The habit had been Ruth's idea. She opened to the back cover, where she kept the few things she carried between volumes: a photograph, a card from the first Arclight office opening, a scrap of paper with a contact number she'd never quite thrown away. And then she found the letter. It had been there all along, clearly, folded into the back cover flap in a way that suggested it had been tucked there deliberately, perhaps years ago, in a moment she hadn't registered because she hadn't been looking. Ruth's handwriting. Thin, careful. The pen pressed lightly the way she always wrote. Maura sat with the letter in her hands for a moment before she unfolded it. "Baby, if you're reading this in a quiet moment, it means you're still carrying it. That's all right. You've always been good at carrying things. But I want you to know something that I should have said louder years ago. You don't have to carry it quietly forever. When it's time, you'll know. You always have. Show up. Sign your name. That's all it ever takes. The light's always on." She read it 3 times. She did not cry. She sat very still in the armchair with the September light coming through the window and the house empty around her, and she read her grandmother's handwriting 3 times and thought about what it meant to finally be in the moment you'd been moving toward without knowing it. Then she folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it back inside the journal cover. She set the journal on the desk. She opened her closet and took out what she would wear the next evening. Simple, quiet, chosen with intention. She reviewed the documents Franklin had sent to the secure server that morning. She wrote one final line in the journal. Then she went to bed. The gala was in 14 hours. She was ready. The Meridian Grand's event team had set up the ballroom by 6. Maura knew because she had reviewed the setup timeline herself, through the event coordinator's planning documents 2 weeks earlier. Everything was where she had approved it to be: the lighting, the AV configuration, the table arrangement, the orchids on each surface. The only thing she had not specified was her own table, which she had requested after all other assignments were made, close to the kitchen corridor, set for 8 with no name cards. She arrived at 6:45. The room was largely empty. A few early guests clustered near the bar. Event staff moved through the space on quiet, rehearsed paths, and the light was still in the warm pre-event configuration, golden and soft, the kind of light designed to make everyone in the room feel slightly more significant than usual. Maura took her seat at table 27 and ordered water. She set the journal on the table beside her place setting. She did not open it. She had written what she needed to write. The room filled gradually, the way these rooms always did. First, the people who came early because they were anxious or important enough to want the full arc of the evening. Then the main current of guests arriving in clusters. Then, precisely 40 minutes after the stated start time, the people who intended to be noticed arriving. Lane entered at 7:38 with Stella on his arm. They moved through the room with the practiced ease of 2 people who had developed a shared rhythm. Lane worked from his right hands, shoulders, the particular set of his mouth that indicated he was genuinely enjoying himself rather than performing enjoyment. Stella worked slightly behind and to his left, which was not an accident. The positioning suggested support rather than partnership, kept Lane as the visual lead while ensuring she was visible to everyone he spoke to. Stella had dressed in red. She knew how to make an entrance. Maura watched them cross the room without moving from her chair. Patricia found the table at 7:50. "You found it," Maura said. "I wasn't looking for it." Patricia looked around the room with the expression of someone who had decided in advance to be unimpressed. "Lane asked me to sit with the board chairman's group, so I thought I'd say hello before everything gets formal." She looked at Maura directly. "I always told Lane he needed someone who matched his level." "I hope you find somewhere you fit, Maura. I genuinely do." She left before Maura could respond. Or perhaps because she didn't want to. Maura looked down at her place setting. Then she looked back up at the room, at the 400 people moving through the golden light, at Stella's red dress catching attention, at the bar, at Lane standing with a group of board members and investors, laughing at something with the specific ease of a man who was certain the room agreed with him. She thought about Ruth's letter. "Show up. Sign your name." Lane took the stage at 8:15. His speech was polished and moving, and full of himself in a way that would have read as confidence to anyone who didn't know the specific texture of the inaccuracies. He spoke about vision and persistence and the decade-plus of work that had brought Arclight to where it stood tonight. He used the first person consistently, cleanly, with no visible effort. The board had been building under his leadership. The culture was one he had worked to create. The growth had been driven by decisions he had made at the right moments. Maura counted 12 statements that were technically false, not fabricated from nothing but reshaped. Events she had initiated that were now attributed to his instinct, frameworks she had built that were now credited to his strategy, relationships she had cultivated through Whitmore Holdings that were now cited as evidence of his business acumen. 12. Then he paused. "Tonight, with full confidence and genuine pride, I am honored to announce the promotion of Stella Grant to Chief Strategy Officer of Arclight Technologies." Applause moved through the room in a clean wave. Stella walked to the stage in the red dress with the unhurried confidence of someone receiving something they had decided was already theirs. Lane handed her a glass of champagne. They raised their glasses to the room together. Board members in the front row stood. Someone near the back started a second wave of applause. At table 27, Franklin Pace appeared at Maura's elbow. She hadn't heard him approach. He set a manila folder on the table in front of her and stepped back slightly, not to disappear, but to give her room. She opened the folder. The authorization form was on top, exactly as he had prepared it. The relevant charter clause was highlighted in a single clean line. Any appointment to Chief Strategy Officer or equivalent requires written authorization from the controlling interest holder of Whitmore Holdings LLC, Arclight's majority shareholder. Maura read the clause. She already knew what it said. She knew what every line of Arclight's charter said. She looked up at the stage. Lane was accepting congratulations from the board chairman, who was shaking his hand with the measured warmth of someone who knew the full governance picture and had been watching this evening arrive for some time. Franklin leaned down, close enough to speak quietly. "The appointment is void until you sign, or decline." He paused. "Your choice, as it always has been." Maura looked at the form, she looked at the stage. She looked at Lane's face in the ballroom light, confident, certain, entirely unaware of what was happening 30 feet from where he stood. Then she uncapped her pen and stood. The distance from table 27 to the stage was roughly 40 feet. Maura covered it in the way she moved through every room she had ever entered without anyone knowing she owned it, steadily, without hurry, with a kind of quiet that had the specific quality of intention. People noticed her because people always notice someone moving through a crowd with that quality of certainty, even when they don't know why they're looking. Lane saw her coming when she was halfway across the room. His face changed in a way she recognized, not recognition exactly, not yet, but the slight shift of a man who has been interrupted in the middle of something he believed was going smoothly. He handed his champagne glass to the person beside him. She reached the stage steps. She went up them. The room had not gone quiet, not entirely, but a current of attention had begun moving through the crowd, the way attention always moved when something happened that didn't fit the choreography of the evening. She reached Lane at the podium. The microphone was live. She did not take it yet. She held the authorization form out to him. "This needs a signature before the appointment is valid," she said, quietly. Just to him for now. He took the form automatically, the reflex of a man accustomed to receiving documents. He looked at it. His eyes moved over the text once, then stopped on the highlighted clause. He read it. She watched him read it. She watched the moment his eyes reached controlling interest holder of Whitmore Holdings LLC. "What is this?" he said. His voice was low, but the microphone picked it up and carried it out into the room. "ArcLight Standard Charter. Any CSO appointment requires authorization from the majority shareholder." She paused. "That's me." He looked at her. His expression was the expression of a man who has put two pieces of information together and does not yet understand what they make. She took the form back from his hand. She set it on the podium. She signed it, Maura Cole, in the clear, unhurried script she used for everything that mattered. Then she turned to the room. Franklin was already moving from the floor toward the small platform at the side of the stage. He stopped at the microphone stand there and spoke without preamble, without theater, in the voice of a man reading a fact into a legal record. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to clarify a point of corporate structure for the record. Whitmore Holdings LLC holds a 67% controlling interest in ArcLight Technologies, Inc. Whitmore Holdings was established in 2013 as the founding entity of this company. Its sole beneficiary and controlling authority is Maura Cole, who has held that position since the company's founding." He paused. "Maura built ArcLight. She has always been ArcLight." The room went quiet in the complete way, not the polite quiet of an attentive audience, but the specific silence of 400 people recalibrating at the same moment. Maura took the podium microphone. She did not raise her voice. She had not needed to. "I built this company at 26 years old in a workspace I rented by the day with a grant I applied for 3 times before someone said yes. I built it because I believed in what I had made, and because no one else believed in it enough to fund it when it only had my name on it. So I built it under a different name, my grandmother's name, and I let the work speak. The work did speak. It has been speaking for 13 years. A pause. The room held it. Everything that has been built in this company, every contract, every patent, every decision, has moved through a structure that bears her name. I am that structure. I always have been. The board chairman, the man who had nodded to Maura at the edge of the room an hour before the event began, stepped forward from the front row. "The authorization form has been signed by the controlling interest holder of Whitmore Holdings," he said. "The CSO appointment submitted under the Emergency Succession Protocol is procedurally void. The protocol does not supersede the majority shareholder provision. The appointment is tabled for proper governance review." He looked at Lane. "Mr. Cole's executive authority as president is suspended, effective immediately, pending a board audit of unauthorized executive decisions over the preceding 12 months. Stella had not moved from the spot where she had been standing when the applause stopped. She stood very still in the red dress, holding the champagne glass, and she looked from Franklin to the board chairman to Maura, and her face moved through several expressions quickly: confusion, calculation, the specific alarm of someone who has realized they have staked their position on a foundation they did not inspect. "You can't," she started. Maura looked at her calmly. "The appointment is void. The governance review will determine next steps." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to add anything else. Patricia Cole's wineglass hit the carpet at the edge of the front tables. The sound was distinct in the silence, a small, sharp, final punctuation. Security appeared at the doors on the left side of the room. Maura looked at the board chairman once. He nodded. She did not need to say anything. The board had been briefed. The plan had been in place for 3 weeks. Every piece of it was exactly where it needed to be. Lane was still at the podium. He had not spoken since the room went quiet. He stood in the gold light of the ballroom with the authorization form in front of him, Signed, final, irrefutable, and he looked like a man watching a building he believed he'd constructed discover it had been built on someone else's ground. Security moved toward the side exit. The board chairman met Lane's eyes and said, simply, "Mr. Cole." Lane moved. He moved the way people move when there is no other direction available. Forward, because forward was the only way out of the room. Stella followed, a step behind, her heels clicking on the marble floor in the particular rhythm of someone trying to maintain dignity that has already left. Maura stood at the head of the stage. She looked out at the room. At the board members, at the investors, at the employees who had worked beside her for years without knowing who she was, who had greeted her as Lane's wife and the consultant and the woman in the back row, and who were now looking at her with expressions that ranged from shock to something that looked very much like relief. She set the microphone down on the podium. She felt, standing there, the precise size of herself. Not larger, not smaller. Exactly right. For the first time in 13 years, she was exactly where she had always been, standing at the head of what she built, and everyone in the room knew it. The board audit ran for 3 weeks. It found 8 instances over 3 years in which Lane Cole had committed company resources beyond the scope of his executive authority, 4 unauthorized access grants for Stella to restricted board materials, 2 expense reimbursements processed under fraudulent conference codes, and 2 instances of external disclosure of proprietary strategy documents under Stella's signature without board notification. The audit report was thorough, factual, and 61 pages long. Lane was formally removed from his role as president on a Thursday afternoon. The press release described it as a transition in executive leadership and attributed it to restructuring in governance following the appointment of ArcLight's founding leadership to direct operational oversight. It was the kind of language corporate communications used when the truth was precise, but the details were better managed quietly. Stella resigned before the formal termination proceedings were completed. She left the city within 2 weeks of the gala, quietly, without the public exit she might have expected, or the explanations she might have offered to anyone who asked. Her LinkedIn profile, once dense with endorsements and strategic positioning, went private and then disappeared. Maura heard from the industry press twice in the following month, asking for comment on Stella's departure. She declined both times. There was nothing to add that the facts didn't already say. Patricia received the notice from Whitmore Holdings' Property Management Division on a Friday morning. The guest suite she had occupied for the better part of a year was attached to a property titled under Whitmore Holdings, purchased 4 years into the marriage, during a period when Lane had focused on the company and had not paid close attention to the details of a real estate transaction he'd assumed was joint. It was not joint. It had never been joint. The notice gave her 30 days to vacate and provided contact information for the property management office if she had questions. Patricia called Maura twice. Maura did not pick up. The third call was directed to Franklin's office, where an assistant politely explained that all communications related to the property transition should go through legal counsel. Lane's divorce attorney contacted Franklin's office in the 3rd week after the gala. The filing was straightforward in its ambition: asset division, claims against equity, spousal support review. The attorney had prepared the documents with the assumption that a $65 billion company's president would have significant equity exposure on behalf of both parties. Franklin scheduled a call and walked the attorney through the corporate structure. Lane's stock options, under his employment contract, had vested over 4 years on a schedule tied to active employment. His administrative suspension had triggered the forfeiture clause. The unvested portion was void. The vested portion represented less than 1% of ArcLight's outstanding shares and had already been transferred to a broker account in Lane's name. It was his to keep, and it was the extent of what he had. ArcLight Technologies itself, as the attorney was informed, was held entirely within Whitmore Holdings, LLC. Whitmore Holdings had been established in 2013, 5 years before the marriage. It was Maura's separate property under any applicable legal framework. There was no marital claim on the company. its assets, its revenue, or its holdings. There was nothing to divide. The call lasted 22 minutes. Maura heard the summary from Franklin the following morning. She sat with it for a moment, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the specific quality of recognition that comes when a long account is finally settled. She had not planned the legal outcome to punish Lane. She had built the structure 13 years ago to protect herself, and it had protected her. That was what it was always for. The industry press ran the story in the 4th week. ArcLight's Phantom Founder was the headline that gained the most traction, not one she would have chosen, but accurate in the essential fact. Profiles ran that she hadn't authorized and couldn't stop. Photographs were sourced from events she'd attended. As Lane Cole's wife, retrospective analyses appeared in 3 major technology publications. She declined all interview requests. The story was already complete. It didn't need her commentary. In the 5th week, a junior supply chain analyst named Marcus stopped by her office. She had seen him in meetings dozens of times. He had been one of the employees who regularly walked past her in the cafeteria when she ate lunch alone there, not ignoring her, simply not seeing her, because she had never been the person in the room he'd been told to notice. He stood in her doorway for a moment, clearly uncertain about whether he should have come. Then he said, "I always thought the real decisions came from somewhere the org chart didn't show. The things that didn't make sense if Lane was the only one behind them. The frameworks that were too consistent over too long a time to be one person's vision." A pause. "Now I know." Maura looked at him. "Thank you, Marcus." He nodded and left. It was the briefest exchange. It was also, in some way, the most complete one. 2 weeks after the gala, Lane appeared in the lobby of ArcLight headquarters at 10:30 in the morning. Maura was at her desk, 2 floors above. The building had a glass atrium on the main floor, and from her office window she could see the lobby's entry corridor when she stood at the right angle. She was standing there when he arrived. She watched him approach the security desk. She watched him speak to the guard, gesture once with his hand, and speak again. She watched the guard consult the screen. She watched Lane's face when the answer came back. He was not on the access list. He had not been on it since his suspension. He looked up once toward the glass above him, not at her specifically, not knowing she was there, just at the building, the way someone looks at something they've lost without understanding how completely it was never theirs. Then he turned and walked back through the entry doors. Maura watched him go. She stood at the window for another moment after he disappeared from view. Then she turned back to her desk. She had a board meeting in 12 minutes. It was a full agenda. There was a lot of work to do. She went back to the work. Lane's attorney requested a brief in-person meeting 3 weeks after the gala, not a mediation session, not a negotiation, just a meeting, 10 minutes, at Maura's discretion. She agreed on her terms. The lobby of ArcLight headquarters. A Thursday morning, 9 o'clock. No counsel present. He was on time. She noticed that. He stood near the security desk in a coat she didn't recognize, looking at the founding plaque on the lobby wall the way people look at things they're trying to understand from the outside. The plaque had been updated the week before. It read now, ArcLight Technologies. Founded 2013 by Maura Whitmore. The previous version had listed the founding leadership team. There had not been a founding leadership team. There had been Maura. She came down from the elevator at exactly 9. He turned when he heard her cross the marble floor. He looked different in a way that had nothing to do with his coat. He was quieter in his body, the specific quality of a person who has had the certainty removed from them and hasn't yet decided what to replace it with. "You lied to me," he said, not as an accusation, more the way a person states a fact they've been sitting with for weeks, just to see how it sounds out loud. "I didn't lie," Maura said. "I was never invisible. You just never looked." He was quiet for a moment. "You let me build my career in your company without telling me." "I gave you the opportunity to build your career in my company," she said. "You had genuine skills when you came in. You used them, and then you used them to erase me." She kept her voice even. She had said this to herself many times. She knew what she needed to say and what she didn't. "I built this company before I met you. I brought you into it because I loved you and I believed in you. For a while that belief was right. Then you chose a different direction. That's not something I hid, that's something you chose. Lane looked at her, then he looked at the plaque again, then back at her. I didn't know, he said. Not defensively, just as a fact. I know, she said. That's what made it possible. He didn't have an answer to that. She hadn't expected one. She waited a moment to make sure he'd heard everything she'd said, and then she said, I'm not angry, Lane. I want you to know that. I was, for a while, but anger is expensive, and I have better things to spend on. A pause. I hope you build something that's actually yours. I think you have the capacity for it. I do believe that. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name precisely. Not gratitude, not anger, somewhere between grief and recognition. Then he nodded once, briefly, and he left. She watched him go through the lobby doors and out into the morning. She stood in the lobby for a while after that. She had been in this building 10,000 times in 13 years, through the first office on the 4th floor, through 3 expansions, through the renovation of the main atrium. She had walked through this lobby as Lane Cole's wife, as the consultant from the advisory board, as the woman from the 3rd floor meetings. She had walked through it as herself exactly once, the night of the gala, when she had come in through the executive entrance before anyone had arrived and stood in the empty atrium for a few minutes, with the city still dark outside the glass. Now it was morning. The building was alive with it, the elevator hum, the badge in beeps, the sound of 100 conversations beginning, the particular energy of a company at work. Her company. Her name was on the wall. She went back upstairs. She sat at her desk and opened her calendar. It was a full day, board prep, a department leads meeting, a call with a government partnership team, 3 contract reviews. The kind of day she had had 10,000 times without anyone in the building, knowing the full weight of who was doing the work. Today they knew. Tomorrow they would know. Every day from here, the name on the wall would be the name behind the decisions, and there would be no gap between what was real and what was visible. She opened the journal. Not to write. She was done needing to write things down simply to remember what was true. She opened it to read Ruth's letter one more time, the one that had been in the back cover all along. Show up, sign your name. She had. She closed the journal and set it aside. She pulled up the first item on the calendar. There was a lot of work to do, and it was hers to do, and she was exactly where she had always been, finally seen, finally counted. If you've been watching someone be invisible in a room they built, share this story. Drop a comment and tell me, did Maura make the right call? I'd love to hear from you.